Good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis N. Hulson, Chief Learning Officer with the National Art Education Association. Thank you for joining us this evening. On behalf of NAEA and the Board of Directors, we hope that you are safe and well during these trying times. Thank you for your direct dedication and passion for art education, for your students, and for your colleagues. It's through members like you that NAEA exists. Tonight, we're using Zoom for webinars, allowing you to see our presenters and use the chat room for questions, comments, and observations. The presenters will answer as many questions as possible at the end of their presentation. This webcast is being recorded and will be available on the NAEA website under Learning, under Need to Know Webcasts for revisiting and for those unable to attend. Tonight, we have Let's Talk, Engaging Social Action Conversation in the Art Room. And it's brought to you by the creative energies of Dr. Amy Filer-Wunder, Professor of Art Education at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. Thank you, Amy, for leading, for facilitating this webcast. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Well, welcome again to the webcast titled Let's Talk, Engaging in Social Action Conversations in the Art Room. As Dennis said, I'm Amy Filer-Wunder, and I teach at Kutztown University, where I have the honor and pleasure of working with future visual art educators and graduate students and K-12 art teachers, all doing amazing work to advocate for the importance of the visual arts in the lives of learners, especially in this world of e-learning. So I thank them so much for all their dedication. Prior to coming to Kutztown, I taught elementary art in a range of settings for 13 years, and I also currently serve as the NAEA board as the Higher Education Division Director. Now I want to turn it over to the other creative energies of this amazing group of colleagues. So Bob, would you introduce yourself?
You bet. Thank you, Amy. Bob Rieker here. I'm a 30-year veteran of the elementary art room. 30 years in the elementary art room. It's a long time, but it's been a great 30 years. I am currently a K-5 art educator in a Title I school in downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. And I'm also an adjunct instructor at Nebraska Wesleyan University, where I teach the elementary art methods course. Been very fortunate to serve twice on the NAEA board, both as elementary division director, as well as recently Western Region Vice President. Go West. And then this July, I have a new thing coming on where I'm going to be president-elect for our state association. So I'm going to send this over to Jamie now to introduce herself.
All right, thanks, Bob. Hi, my name is Jamie Lynn Brown. I've been an artist and educator for 18 years. I work in a middle school setting with 7th and 8th grade at Centerville Middle School in Lancaster, PA. I've had the opportunity to work with Dr. Filer-Wunder at Kutztown recently in an EDD program for transformational teaching and learning, and I'm happy to be a part of this. So I'll send it over to Mary Kate.
Hi everyone, my name is Mary Kate Berg. I am a high school art educator in Maryland. I've been teaching for 7 years. I have taught both middle school and high school, and I'm excited to be here. Now to you, Lorinda.
Thank you, Mary Kate. Hello, I'm Lorinda Rice. I am the current Supervision and Administration Division Director, and I am a curriculum specialist in Lincoln Public Schools and have the honor of working with Bob Rieker every day in this district. And we're excited to have you here. I've taught for 22 years and have been in supervision for about 9 years now already. It goes fast. So we're happy you're here with us. We're excited to share with you what we've been going through in our journey of engaging in social action. So Amy, back to you.
All right, thank you, Lorinda, and thanks everybody for sharing a little bit about yourselves. So once again, thanks for joining us, and let's get started. We do have a wealth of classroom examples to share with you on this topic and a little bit of where we're headed this evening. So we're going to begin with an overview of navigating tensions that we might encounter when talking about challenging topics in the classroom. We'll also explore why our professional identity is an important consideration when engaging in dialogue on topics focused on ED&I. We're also going to look at questions we reflected upon as educators for this presentation and questions we think you might be asking yourself. And then we'll also share, of course, examples and stories by the educators that just introduced themselves. So the who should I be versus the who am I? This image is from one of my previous pre-service teachers, an illustration she made exploring professional identity and the tensions we can experience as teachers, especially cultural and societal expectations of what it means to be a teacher, to teach. I know I certainly had concerns, and still do, as a teacher on what types of conversations and dialogue are acceptable in my classroom. How do I respond to questions that might be considered too political or too controversial? Here, in a playful manner, with the googly eyes, the teacher highlights the student's concern for doing it right, as the teacher is feeling the same tension or concern. Using some of my earlier work on the topic, I often pose the question that I feel like we wrestle with as teachers: the who should I be versus the who am I? Both in terms of what to bring in the classroom, both as the teacher and for your students in terms of voice, and the who should I be and who am I in terms of professional identity. What do we share about ourselves? What do we keep hidden? So what is professional identity, and how might we define it? This is a definition that I've continued to return to over the last number of years. As professionals, we have inner and outer worlds. An inner world where we aspire to our own identities, and an outer world where the social reality of our identities can be assumed by others or even imposed by others. Our professional identities are complex and best viewed as eco-contextual, to include social identities such as race and ethnicity, religion, economic status, social class, gender, nationality, chosen interests, sexual identity, politics, and personal history. As we think about these complex layers, I return to the work of Frances Kendall as part of my ongoing reflective practice as a teacher and as a researcher. So how do we build layers of understanding towards critical social justice? It starts with the personal, moves to the interpersonal, and then can move to a space of social justice in action. In my earlier research, I explored how my working class impacted my worldview and views of the learners and curriculum development. Examining one's positionality is ongoing and a space of becoming. I needed to unpack what it meant to be a teacher through class. I grew up in Iowa on a farm, but also gender and race, specifically looking at what my privileges afford me as a white teacher. Frances Kendall, in the book I have featured here, titled Understanding White Privilege, calls individuals to action by starting with that deep personal work of examining the intersections of our identities. I needed to look not just at the challenges I faced growing up working class and as a first-generation college student, but also how my whiteness influenced choices in curriculum. Milner calls for the importance of researching self to note the dangers of color and culture-blind research in PK through 12 educational settings. What type of conversations might we avoid or dismiss based on our identities as educators because they make us uncomfortable or others in the room? Or have concerns with how they would be viewed by others, how conversations would be interpreted by families, community, administrators. How might we maintain lessons that are not representative of our students' lives? Do our students see themselves in their curriculum? To accomplish moving to more self-critical reflection, the conversations have to happen with others, and this is the interpersonal part. This happens through having a critical friend where you can peel back the layers of investigating blind spots in our thinking to a space of honesty and vulnerability around recognizing we all hold biases, known and unknown, in how we see others. Following this interpersonal dialogue, we can begin to think more deeply through a critical social justice lens and how our identities impact views of the learners and curricular decisions. Tonight, the art teachers that introduce themselves and Lorinda as an art supervisor will share specific curriculum projects that moved into a space of honoring learner voice to ignite change, the social action justice piece. To do so, the educators featured this evening reflected on these questions. How do educators navigate building relationships with learners when discussing conversations on topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility? How do we traverse these difficult topics to prepare learners for engaging in critical dialogue? Is it truly possible to develop an open and brave space for student-learner voice, agency, and action? And how do we foster listening to understand and the capacity to empathize with differing perspectives? So Shyla Rao, a principal in the Baltimore schools and one of my critical friends, and I named this work Empowered Voice Pedagogy, which, as Kendall advocated for, begins with self-reflection in one's personal and professional identity and moves into dialogue, speaking and listening with a critical colleague, which Lorinda Rice and I have also done over the past several months. Then outwardly, we move to include learners in what it means to give voice in educational settings and develop curriculum more acutely aligned with students' lived experiences. So in this image, I really wanted to try to communicate what voice means, because in some of my earlier work, I felt like I needed to go a little deeper, because voice can be read in a lot of different ways. So voice to me involves communicating in a range of modalities as humans. This could be speaking or signing through movement, but creating is integral in this piece because we look at how voice is communicated through images and symbols in the art room. Voice is also in tandem in a relationship with others who listen and reflect on the ideas shared, thus a space of interplay, always working toward empathic understanding. So I hope my reflections have helped set the stage for the examples to follow so that you can see these ideas in practice. So now I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter to hear stories and examples from the classroom. And we start with Mary Kate, who teaches at the high school level. Mary Kate, it's all you.
Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
To open up, I would like to start with a quote by Brené Brown. Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. In our classrooms, we have the opportunity to provide students a space where their vulnerability and voice is welcomed to be explored and embraced. But what does voice mean from the perspective of a high school student? I was stumped after receiving this positive note one day. Everyone has a voice in this class. Do they mean everyone feels comfortable? Do they mean everyone feels like they can speak freely? Then I wondered, they're using their voice to speak their perspective of the class. Do their classmates share this same view? A key part to developing true, valuable relationships with our students is looking at what it means to have voice in a school setting. What is our definition versus what is our students' definition? Voice involves having a dialogue, whether that be verbal or visual, but a dialogue involves not just a share, but it involves a listener. To engage in dialogue is one of the simplest ways we can begin as teachers, scholars, and critical thinkers to cross boundaries, the barriers that may or may not be erected by race, gender, class, professional standing, and a host of other disciplines. Bell Hooks has provided me guidance on my journey of thinking about voice, dialogue, equity, diversity, and social action within my classroom. The first part of my journey involved creating a dialogue with myself about my personal and professional identity, investigating the many intersectionalities of both and analyzing which identities are most at play when I'm in the classroom. This thought work took the form in the creation of various visual journals as a way to communicate my dialogue. Much of this work involved me acknowledging the many successes and failures I have had as a teacher over the past 7 years. Learning to lean into the uncomfortable, learning to embrace the tensions that occurred, and allowing myself to be vulnerable. This forced me to relook at my classroom practice and curriculum choices. How can I promote and enable all students to embrace vulnerability? Authentic relationships are key to creating classrooms that are social action-based and promote equity and inclusion. To return to Brené Brown, she states, as humans, we strive for connection as it gives us purpose and reason. Students will perform for people who invest not just in them as students, but as a human. First step meant relooking at how I create community within my classroom. Am I fostering authentic communities? Do my students know their peers? Do they know their names? Do they know some of their story? To start off each semester, my classes create a set of classroom norms. This is a truly student-driven process and requires 100% student agreement. We use a setting agreements activity through critical friends to guide our process. All of my classes also participate in weekly community circles, also known as restorative circles, an opportunity for students to share, listen, and connect in an equal platform. All classes also participate in a frequent get-to-know-you activity. They are such as friend bingo, walk the line, would you rather. These activities are low risk and provide students an opportunity to observe and learn about shared experiences and values with their peers. These activities also allow students to be vulnerable on their own terms. What do my students perceive as voice in the classroom though? Having a voice in class doesn't mean just being willing to raise your hand and share your opinion. It's about being involved and being an active participant. Using strategies that promote 100% involvement that are low risk are imperative to engaging all student voices. Philosophical chairs, which is an avid strategy for quick and easy discussions, works well for students who are both extroverted and introverted. Silent chalk talk, which is discussion questions posted around the room that students circulate through silently. It provides a wonderful way for students to reflect, generate ideas, and also for you to check on student learning. Students have the opportunity to build off of their peers' answers as well, creating a quiet, silent dialogue in the classroom. And one of my favorite strategies, the parking lot, is a space in the room for students to voice anything and everything that they'd like to share. These can be anonymous. They're often questions, something positive that happened in class, a change they think is needed, or an aha moment. This strategy makes the internal dialogue of a classroom community transparent. I'm also an avid survey giver. Google Forms is a great tool to use to gather data, as it will visualize the students' responses into graphs and charts. When I first started giving surveys, I kept the feedback to myself. But this year I took a risk and involved my classes in this process. These images are survey results from a check-in of one of my classes after 2 weeks of holding class. We discussed how, as a class, we can continue to work towards building a stronger community, since it clearly was noted that we still had some work to do. Bringing them into this dialogue and reflection process not only promoted my growth professionally, but my students' growth and responsibility in the development of our classroom environment. Building community involvement and reflection into my practice has helped me influence my curricular choices. Making sure our projects are open and reflective of the various voices in my classroom is important to me. My goal is for my students to understand that they are stakeholders in their learning and, most importantly, in their community. The Never Hide piece was a visual journal entry by one of my seniors. When I asked her about it, she responded, "Miss Berg, do you know how many magazines I had to look through to find this many pictures of women of color? It was too many." So this entry developed a rich dialogue between the two of us on representation in the media and a suggestion that I might need new magazines. Making issues visible that are often invisible within our communities is what I want to help guide my students to do. This couldn't happen without trust and understanding that our perspectives are valued and accepted. The Black Lives Matter tile that was created by a student a few years ago when the movement had just started to gain traction. This student recently became a founding member of our first Black student union at our high school. Students are more likely to be receptive of new ideas when they feel safe to explore and express those ideas. Creating classrooms where all voices and vulnerability levels are embraced takes time, takes reflection, and takes building a strong foundation of community. Thank you so much for listening, and now I'd like to introduce Jamie to share stories from a middle school setting.
Thank you, Mary Kate. I selected this first image because it reminds me of the most exciting experience we have as art educators, the beginning of a student's active expression. There's an energy that's hard to describe other than the anticipation of what is yet to be, and the joy that comes as I observe this bubbling activity of a captured moment. Ai Weiwei is one of the artists that I featured with my students, and I'd also like to open with this quote. Creativity is the power to reject the past, to change the status quo, and to seek new potential. Simply put, aside from using one's imagination, perhaps more importantly, creativity is the power to act. Two observations within my context compelled me to search for a way to inspire change. First, a classroom incident, students responding negatively to a culture they were unfamiliar with. And then secondly, an increase in discipline referrals for negative student interactions and bullying. A commonality between these two events is a student's perception of and reaction to others outside their accepted social groups. I was haunted by the memory of my students' uncomfortable reaction to a culture and was motivated to use my specialty area as a vehicle for promoting positive change. Some students had already begun to investigate social justice issues on their own within my curriculum, like this example, Beauty by Bullying, and served as inspiration to build a safe or brave space in my own environment for students to investigate difficult and contemporary topics. Activist art can communicate ideas about individuals and community experiences to a wider audience. It can make public that which has been ignored, silent, or kept from public conscious. The work of Dewhurst inspired me to initiate an activist art club to test out curricular design before introducing it to the general population. I used the name Change It Up, a catchy play on words to convey my intent to create positive change. 7 students signed up to participate and met once per week. I broke up the Change It Up curriculum into 3 thematic units, defining injustice, personal connections, and then the creation of activist artwork. Activist art strategies of connecting, questioning, and translating the creative process are ones that I employ with my students. One thing I learned by going through this process was that creating a safe place in my classroom required community and relationship building between my students, but also with myself. It was necessary for me to share my vulnerability with students. For example, stories where I didn't feel safe. I was bullied in middle school. I didn't realize how emotional it still was for me to share my story publicly, but it was beneficial for my students to see that side of me. This is an image of the first concept map students created as a group as they unpacked the meaning of injustice. Students collaboratively constructed a definition of social justice, disrupting, dismantling the oppressive structures in society so that voices of all individuals could be heard. During the second segment, Personal Connections, students examined of how 4 selected contemporary artists address social issues in their context. And then to culminate these experiences, students synthesize their learning through the creation of activist art that tells the story of an injustice experienced personally, observed, or participated in, and imagine what could otherwise be. A group dialogue resulted with questions from this student. How do I show violence being done to the LGBTQ community so that everyone can understand? How do I keep it appropriate for school? The students then discussed how symbolic images could represent death and murder. They decided that a grouping of crows is called a murder of crows, and she decided to use that to symbolically represent the violence. She chose red yarn to create the barbed wire, which symbolizes danger. The game pieces spell out her ideas for change. This makes a beautiful analogy of people coming together as we do over a table playing a board game. She says, this piece is important because every day people of different gender and race are being discriminated against, and that's not okay. My project is showing that the many different genders of the LGBTQ community and what I want to see change. Mass media plays a role in perceptions of equal access, equal opportunity, fair treatment, and respect of others. The line between reality and fiction become blurred through unspoken subtext of fashion magazines, television, and film. Mass media is an outlet for expressing dominant narratives to the public and begins to dictate what normal people should look like and how they should act. This student created a poster series featuring reflective questions on an acetate overlay. What is beauty? What affects your self-image? She then invited viewers to interact with the images and text of the work through a response page. She says, I made this project so that girls would look at themselves in a different way. Girls are being affected by social media and the image of the perfect person. I've seen friends being affected by this, and I want to stop them from having these terrible thoughts. Over 40 different tables were hand-drawn to create this stop animation. This student shared that 20 years ago, her grandparents had a family friend that came out to them. Her grandparents felt such compassion for this friend, they started taking other members of the LGBTQ community into their own home for a meal or a place to stay. The tables she meticulously drew represent the people that come into her grandparents' home to find a place to be heard, accepted, and valued. Obtaining a place to sit around the table is a powerful symbol of equality gained through the hospitality of others. Her family has made their own extended family inspired by the love of a family friend. This artwork illustrates the positive change that can occur in a community through small, compassionate actions and a single dinner table. The student on the top left created a set of posters explaining that it is okay for classmates to extend friendship and acceptance of the student transgender community. The broken mirrors on the top right visually illustrate how internally the sense of self-identity and efficacy are shattered by socially constructed narratives, while externally hiding these emotions from view. Packaging tape was manipulated in the bottom left to construct a semi-transparent sculpture, allowing viewers to be aware of text containing painful personal experiences with racism without the ability to decipher them. The student in the last piece documented building relationships with peers in an autistic support room through collaborative art in order to work through her own misconceptions about disability. Building this curriculum with my students gave me the opportunity to work intimately with a small group of students. Their perspective informs my process as I prepare to offer parts of what we co-constructed to a larger group of students in the future. The arts serve as a vehicle to promote social justice in the classroom. The lived experiences of students are a valuable asset to be harnessed throughout the creative process and engages each learner holistically. Allows students to choose the direction of classroom exploration and discover how their own identity is entwined with the world around them. The innate desire to create and communicate ideas is human. Let us acknowledge how all humans are makers. Contemporary art, social justice, and activism are integral in fanning the flames of engagement in the classroom. When a student's knowledge is valued and permitted, it creates the possibility to imagine new beginnings. Thank you. Next, we're going to hear examples in the elementary classroom with Bob Rieker.
All right, thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it. Such great messages so far. I've really enjoyed it. So as you heard when I introduced myself, I am a 30-year veteran of the elementary art classroom, and most of my career was spent in the middle-class suburban classrooms and schools until about 3 years ago. I really needed a change, and I got it when I moved to a very diverse Title I building with 93% free and reduced lunch, and very culturally diverse, as I mentioned. It also had a very large ELL population. So as a white educator going into this very culturally diverse building, I've had to embrace and to model that all does mean all. I think you're going to hear that from Lorinda here in just a few minutes. And I had to do that in terms of my relationships with students and with their families. It was important for me to demonstrate a cultural awareness and sensibility that culture means many different things to different people. Embracing many perspectives are represented in the problems that I help facilitate, as well as the solutions that children create as part of the curriculum that I prepare for them. Infusing my curriculum with creators that look like my students, speak like my students, and come from origins like my students is really important. It's also important that students see themselves in the curriculum and in the school culture. So the example of the office mural on here is something that I designed this winter, and I painted it, and it speaks to school culture. I collaborated with our school secretary, who was going to be looking at it every single day. She needed to have a voice in that, of course. We used the quote that was on the wall, and then I was able to use both kids as well as adults in adding handprints throughout the image. That was important that as part of that quote that was included. So to kick this off, I'd like to look through the ED&I lens at the topics of hope, cultural appropriation, and remote learning. If you work with children in poverty and or children who experience trauma, the concept of hope is a focus of need. Hope for students in a Title I school must be integrated into all aspects of school culture. One of the authors of Innovative Voices in Education, Engaging Diverse Communities, wrote the article referenced on this slide. During their graduate work, the author created the Hope Wheel. Its origins are in the Native American medicine wheel. Medicine in tribal tradition refers to any substance, process, teaching, song, story, or symbol that helps to restore balance in human beings and their communities. The medicine wheel is an ancient symbol which represents an entire worldview, really a way of seeing and knowing, and the teachings that go with it. The components of the Hope Circle include understanding, respect, responsibility, and relationships. The Hope Wheel became a powerful guide for colleagues and the author as they navigated the varied cultural perspectives of students. They placed students on the Hope Wheel relative to their experiences in life and how they viewed them and the emotions created as a result. As they became aware of their social, emotional, and cognitive states, the educators were able to work with students in purpose-driven contexts as they learned to advance themselves on the wheel in different domains of learning how to know, do, be, and live with each other. Educators formed meaningful dialogue around each student's variable position on the wheel and used the graphic model as a template for personal growth. I see there is great validity in utilizing the concepts in this model in developing students' awareness of their level of hope and what areas of growth that will assist them in achieving hope for their future. The student collaborative painting that you see here on the left is an example of a work created with an artist in residence at my school in the fall of 2018. Let's explore this experience just a little further that I had with my fourth graders. So we had a local artist named Christian Scott who joined us. He was commissioned by the Lincoln Arts Council to work with my fourth graders over approximately a quarter of time. And we chose the concept of hope because that was part of our school focus. It made sense to delve into that with the art that we were going to create. So to make it more concrete for 10-year-olds, our prompt was very simple. It was, in my future. We left it very open-ended. Most explored education and career paths in groups of 3 to 4, but then some of them also thought about hope as a personal piece as well. So Christian was able to visit 3 times. The first time he did an introduction and a demonstration of his process. The second time, kids got the opportunity to explore materials with him. And then about 2/3 of the way through for his third time, he came in and did a feedback and critique session with the kids. This experience allowed for my students to explore the concept of hope in relation to each student's future. And then additionally, Christian, who is biracial, is a graduate of the same high school as many of my students who will graduate from someday as well. It was a great connection. Many saw themselves in Christian, his success, his interest, as well as his skills in art and his thinking. Now, the fun thing is we also had a closing event for this where families came, and it included art making, an exhibit, there was food, and each child also received a bag of art supplies to take home to continue exploring. Now I'd like to delve into ED&I and cultural appropriation. Appropriation and cultural appropriation are buzzwords in education. Art educators must continually explore how to best balance inspiring students to create without taking imagery and ideas from others that infringes on cultural identity and artistic property. I highlighted this article titled Appropriate Use of Indigenous Content due to its concise definition of cultural appropriation, as well as examples and non-examples and ways in which art educators could explore Native topics in a culturally sensitive and aware manner. My philosophy of honoring artists and cultures is really threefold. One, I capitalize on my students' backgrounds and interest in developing art problems to have them solve. Working in a Title I school, my students' schema and knowledge of world topics can be somewhat limited. I work to know where my students are at, provide some support and scaffolding, and then let them create based on their previous and acquired knowledge. The second thing I do, I provide multiple inspirations for art problem consideration. My young creators are not the artists Zaha Hadid, Dohosu, or Edward Hopper. However, if I want to facilitate a creative experience around place and space, I would use these and other artists to inspire. And finally, third, I keep art problems open-ended. Offering art problems based on themes and questions allow for students to enter in and develop ideas based on their connections to the theme and topic. So the examples that are here are around the topic of nature and landscape. And for each of the grade levels, I would give them a different prompt, different materials, and different inspirations for them to be able to explore. Here are some more examples. I use things like inquiry and exploration, mind mapping, peer and group input, as well as sketching from a problem or question. The work created by my young learners is varied and speaks to who each is as a creator and a human being. And although art educators will say that elementary students are too young to understand appropriation and cultural appropriation, I respond by saying we need to teach them at young ages that just because something is clever or something is beautiful, it doesn't give you the freedom to take or claim as something as your own. We need to teach them while they're young. And finally, we were all thrust just a few weeks ago into remote, at home, emergency. You can use whatever adjective you would like to. This kind of learning just a few weeks ago. States, districts, K through 12 schools and colleges and universities, as well as educators, struggled to determine how to best serve learners away from brick and mortar classrooms. And it was and continues to be a struggle. We worry about the well-being of our learners, their physical, emotional, social, and educational needs, and are they being met? And we know for some, one or many of these are not being successfully addressed, and for lots of different reasons. In providing art education experience for our learners in our district, it was key that we were aware that many students may only have a drawing tool, a paper surface, and objects around them. And for some, none of that was even available. So we created art experiences that could be done by most any student in any learning conditions across our city. The article that's on here highlights how we can provide 5 essentials providing trauma-informed online teaching. The article shares 1, have a welcoming virtual classroom. 2, be aware of your needs and the strengths of you as an instructor. 3, continue to build and strengthen relationships. 4, routines and positive feedback are key. And 5, provide opportunities for student agency. So finally, I thought this shoe image was very appropriate. It is indicative of what so many K through 12 art educators have asked students to create using items around them. And yet at the same time, the shoes are symbolic of different life experiences for our children, whether happy or sad, rich or poor, trauma-filled or no trauma. Thank you for letting me share today, and we're off to Lorinda, who's going to share next.
Thank you, Bob. You've seen some wonderful examples of how these educators are navigating building relationships with learners within the topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. So now let's look how, as an art curriculum specialist, I support teachers in Lincoln Public Schools. In our district, our students and their families represent 152 different countries, and over 100 different languages are spoken in our schools. Superintendent Dr. Joel can often be heard in buildings and in the media saying all means all. How are we supporting all students to succeed? This has been our motto for a number of years. During our administrator leadership days this year at the school beginning, we were asked to decide if we were going to be comfortable or courageous. We invited students to tell us their experiences in our classrooms, and we listened. They told us things like, we want to see ourselves in the curriculum. We want to be challenged more. We want teachers to expect more and hold us to it. We were tasked with reviewing and looking at our materials to make sure they represent all types of people and that all activities included the instructional program that was inclusive and pluralistic. That is, students of varying cultures, ethnic, and religious heritage should be able to feel included and feel comfortable being included. Our curriculum had already begun this journey. We have been working on it for a little bit of time, but we still have a long ways to go. We had already started conversations on topics of cultural appropriation, and we're diving into other topics as well. I had used the popular group Yes Theory, known by many of our students, to ask my teachers to seek discomfort, try something new, and let's look at some of the things that we've been going through. As the NAEA Supervision and Administration Director, I am using my Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion training to support teachers and other supervisors as a way to model change for our curriculum and instruction. This image, taken from my training manual, is posted next to my phone and computer in my office, along with a quote by Michael R. Hammer, which reads, "Developing intercultural competence is a core capability in the 21st century that involves cultural self-awareness and culture other understanding, along with the ability to adapt one's mindset and behavior to bridge across differences." As we move into yet a more global world where we are connected every day with people around the world, how important is that quote to us as educators of the future? I have also asked my staff of 93 teachers to be my accountability partners on this journey to make sure we are looking through the dimensions of diversity. Asking the question, how might listening to understand students' differing perspectives and experiences in our rooms change what and how we teach? Acknowledging that not every student we have in our rooms will become a professional artist, we had to revise our vision of what art means for all students. Shifting our focus from walking students through a teacher-led step-by-step process to a well-crafted end product that many students would often throw away at the end of the semester, we needed to add a more human element to our units. Carefully balancing time in developing students' skills and techniques with students' pursuit of personal meaning making is changing the student experience in our art classrooms. We began to delve into what it really means to develop critical thinking for careers and college-ready students, ready for jobs that have not yet been created, with skills to see the world in new ways. This quote by Gerjoy invites us to help students see and understand failure through how to learn, unlearn, and relearn, how to classify and unclassify or reclassify and look at problems in new directions, and doing this in a 50-minute class period and over time. Our curriculum includes the use of art research journals, taking photos of process of making, giving, receiving, and applying peer feedback, and reflecting on the process and final work so that we can teach our students how to teach themselves. Shifting our focus from genres and materials, we have begun using themes often aligned with themes studied in other curriculum areas. As the entry points for creativity. You want to go ahead and forward for me, Dennis? Thank you. Themes or big ideas allow for student voice and agency, often reflecting personal identities in ways we had always hoped for in our other units. Sydney Walker reminds us by using big ideas, students find that art making is more creating and interesting than design or learning a particular technique with a specific medium. Art making becomes an expression of important ideas related to their own lives and the lives of others around them. Reviewing our units, we began to notice that teachers often share some of the same artists year after year throughout a student's K-12 art experience. We began to ask the question, why, when there are so many creative solutions from around the world, are we not showing more artists' work? Noting that this was one way we could meet the requests of students' desire to see themselves in our curriculum, teachers are encouraged to use diverse ranges of artists who are creating around the same theme. This is a snapshot of a growing list of artists we share as a collaborative group. So how am I supporting teachers as we traverse those potentially highly politicized topics to prepare learners for engaging in critical dialogue, intentional planning of our professional learning opportunities. This year, 2 of our sessions included cultivating learning experiences for all students and using contemporary artist themes and student scaffolding for student understanding. Having teachers lead these sessions allows our staff to hear from the teacher's tested practice. Based in research and theory, we create teacher community cultures in which we can be open and vulnerable to change. Teachers model different expected instructional strategies during these sessions. Our goals are changing due to the work of Robert Dilt's Levels of Learning. It impacted our thinking about purpose. We invited students and teachers to ask these questions. What is their story to tell visually? How do we help them create authentic bodies of work in which they're making meaning of their world? Our end in mind goal transformed the capabilities to the student's why. Creating environments in which we believe all students can succeed means that we must be brave and persevere in supporting our students. As warm demanders, our art teachers are building rapport through actively listening to students' struggles, continually convincing them of their own potential, and constantly examining how they are creating environments that help students learn, unlearn, and relearn. Moving from dependent to independent learners by holding high standards and encouraging productive struggle. Peggy McIntosh's work, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, reminds us that we must also be aware of our own implicit biases and overcome the inner dialogue of our personal experiences. Teachers are bravely addressing unconscious racial biases and being open to listening to peers without shutting down or becoming defensive. Recently, after a training, a teacher confronted another teacher about the language she was using during our conversation of the meeting. Both teachers carefully listened to each other, and they have now created a new peer accountability partnership in which both teachers are eager to grow and be able to meet the needs of their very diverse students. This is not an easy process, and we acknowledge the fact that every step forward, there will be moments that we fall back. One of the great things about my staff is their willingness to keep falling forward and persevering. Another opportunity that we have in our district is that I encourage book studies. We started out with many book studies on creativity, and now we've moved into book studies that include the work of Zaretta Hammond, Robin DiAngelo, and Bell Hooks. These book studies allow us to engage in conversations about what barriers our cultural lenses might be creating in our very diverse classrooms. Circling back to being intentional about the artists we are choosing, we are noticing students sitting up, raising their heads off the tables, and listening intently to hear about these artists. They are beginning to contribute to class conversations and pursue art making for their own purposes. Teachers are modeling making thinking visible. You heard a few of those examples tonight by these teachers. Scaffolding how to use Venn diagrams or Cornell notes to think deeply about artists and the themes can inspire student creativity. Students are uncovering common threads of these artists' different experiences to jumpstart their own creativity. I'm going to let you take a moment to read this slide. This quote was a quote that a small group of art teachers and I were privileged to hear at the Harvard Project Zero conference with director Flossie Chua. Flossie encourages us at that conference to start to create or curate our own lessons with many artists to provide different lenses and frameworks in which students can relate. She also asked us to provide videos and stories of these artist processes as a way to validate the students' process and experience in our art rooms. And finally, she told us that we needed to be intentionally providing these connections to create student agency and a classroom in which our students move from compliant or engaged to empowered learners and creative thinkers. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity and these many wonderful teachers' experiences. Amy?
Thanks, Lorinda, so much. Dennis, can you go back to the slide where it said peripheral visions? I just wanted to sum it up with a quote before we take time for some questions. So I hope you see from the many examples shared this evening how it illustrated the importance of teachers reflecting on their professional identities, being vulnerable, being brave, being courageous, as many people said, to ensure that learners see themselves represented in curriculum, such as considering the themes in the curriculum, the artists that we select, and the space that we create for voice, as I mentioned before. The communicating and creating from their perspectives and lived experience, and having time for listening and reflecting. So critical in social action and social justice work in the art room. And this is a quote that I read as a beginning graduate student, and I still come back to. Not only do we know, we don't know what we teach. All societies pass on complex patterns, conventions of human relations, language roughly comparable in their basic complexity, whether or not they have ever been written down. And it's just a reminder of equity, diversity, inclusivity, and accessibility work in thinking very deeply about what we communicate in our classroom by what we teach and how we see our learners. And I just want to thank this amazing team for sharing their real examples in the classroom, and thank so many people for being part of our conversation tonight. And I think we have time for questions. I'll turn it over to Dennis to help us with that part.
Sure, thank you, Amy. We did have one technical question, and that was if the links work within the presentation, and they do not. But we are going to send a reference sheet to everyone in the next day or so. So many questions, so many great questions. So I'll just start with mine as I scroll through and look at others. So how did it come to be for all of you to really look in the mirror and think hard about your own privilege, your own place in life, your family, your schools, your education, and now working with students? How did that happen? And all of you, if you could unmute your mics and just have a little discussion about your own experience. Anyone can go first.
I'll start a little bit. So I shared a little bit about some of my earlier work when I was in graduate school. I started thinking a lot about the curriculum that was being taught. I was in a great district with many elementaries. I can't remember the number, but let's say 15 to 20 elementary schools. And as I would visit them, just the discrepancies in how the curriculum was enacted without not necessarily the students in mind. And again, it was a great district, and it was at the time when this work was really just starting. And thinking about, did that same curriculum used across one district really match the needs of the learners in each of those spaces? And part of that comes from a story that I've told many times about being a farm girl, and the only artwork I ever remember seeing was a piece by Renoir, a girl with the watering can. Some of you might recall that. And as I reflected on that as a graduate student, I thought, how did that have to do with me? I mean, she's beautiful and she had this beautiful little dress, but I was a farm girl. I took off my uniform when I got home from school and went out and played on in our big yard and our acreage. And so I don't know, it just made me start to think about class a lot, because I was taking classes in language and literacy, and how we were understanding language and literacy in terms of schools and what we were expecting of students. And again, it wasn't always honoring their way of learning, their language, their cultural experiences. And so just that started, 15 years of thinking about who we are and how that impacts how we see our learners. And then it was people that I started working with that helped me to do the deep work of thinking about privilege, such as being white, and how we need to think about that as teachers, especially in a field that's predominantly white? And again, are we ensuring that our students are seen? And Mary Kate's example of the student helping her see that her magazines needed to be different. I think those are just being aware of those important aspects in our teaching. So it never stops. It's always about conversation in my mind.
Any others on that response? How did it come to be?
Yeah, mine has been kind of threefold. One, I work for a great district that takes individual needs and culture really, really seriously. And that's an important part of our curriculum. That's an important part of our instruction. Another piece of it is I'm currently, I teach at the college level, and working with college level students and having that be part of my curriculum has also been kind of a growth moment for me. And I spend every semester talking to students who are going to be our new teachers coming into this. And then finally, it's my great experiences as being a leader for NAEA, because the growth in ED&I work and culture has been incredible over the last 2 times that I've been part of the board.
Thanks. So we're going to go over in time a little bit, and we're allowed to do that. We do have a question for Mary Kate. I'm currently an arts educator in high school. Have you dealt with students who take social issues as a joke or very one-sided? How do these students participate in activities such as you've described?
I definitely have. I think teaching high school, we're going to get all sorts of responses to what we give our students as content. And, things are definitely situational, but I currently have been asked this year to teach a values and diversity class, and it's really given me some tools on how to work with some of those more challenging students that are going to kind of push you there with patience. And before we ever begin to talk about social issues, we always start with self-exploration, learning about what we believe, what our them as a student believes in, where do those beliefs come from, and being able to support why they may hold a certain belief or value. And then slowly we build to looking at what are issues within our community, and our community as in our school and our local community. And then we begin to kind of grow out into larger issues. As far as the activities, it's, very student based on the student, but when it comes to community circles, all of my students must stand in the circle, but they never have to speak. They can always pass. So a lot of the activities that we do, I ask for students to participate maybe through just standing up. They might not want to go find a partner to cross off something on a worksheet, but they're at least standing and still involving themselves in the activity to some extent. But providing that choice of, I understand maybe why you don't want to participate today. I can see that. Maybe we'll try again tomorrow. But always kind of providing that support to understanding where they might be coming from, but also, suggesting that we'll just try it again. And maybe at some point they'll break. But high school, they definitely can provide some interesting situations when it comes to some of the low risk activities.
Thank you, Mary Kate. A quick technical tip of the recording of this webcast. When you see the recording, the video and the chat is not overlaid on top. It is to the side. A quick question for Lorinda. We have a question about the model that you used for referencing. What was it called?
The model that I use for referencing, not exactly sure what model we.
The one with the eye.
Oh, the one, the diversity levels. Yeah, if you would go back to that, Dennis, it really is a space for me and my teachers to think through the different pieces that are playing out in our worlds as we move from our own personalities out into broader pictures. And so we can think about ethnicity or sexual orientation in that primary level, or if we move into the secondary level, we're also thinking about what are the social skills or the things going on in the location where those students are coming from, and even our teachers. And then what's that cultural level? We build onto that on that that next stage. And so we want to think through all of those different levels when we're listening and when we're thinking about developing our curriculum.
Thank you, Lorinda. There was a question about whether or not your list of artists could be available. I don't have an answer to that for.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, those are just links. We can't share it out, unfortunately, from our district because it is behind a walled garden. But what we started doing was, as educators, we started sharing different exhibits that we had been to, the different themes that they were coming up with. And I just went to those different places, looked up those artists, and started doing research on them. And so now teachers can go in and find those. They can link to them directly. It saves them maybe a couple steps, but not really, because then they start digging in deeper and going further with those.
Here's a quick tip from Peg Goach. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Peg, I apologize. But she says that the Smithsonian American Art Museum is looking for middle and high school teachers for a new pilot on the topic of live free video conferencing program, social commentary, social action. You can contact her. She's the distance learning coordinator at koetscphp@si.edu. Let me say that again, forgive me. koetschp@si.edu. Lots of questions. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Sorry about that. By the way, participants, there have been more than 200 people tuned in tonight. Very impressive in these challenging times. Thank you for contributing your time and your energy and your talent and your learning with us this evening.
And Dennis, just as a reminder, we put together a reference list of the many articles and websites that were mentioned throughout the presentation, and additional readings and references that we enjoy or have been reading. So we put that together, and Dennis is going to send that out to everybody. And we also put our contact information. So if you have further questions, you'll be able to email us at the emails provided. And Lorinda or Mary Kate and Jamie and Bob, if there's artists that you want to send me on a list, I can add it to that reference list I could update that tomorrow morning really quickly and send it to Dennis so that people could have a list of the artists as well.
Sure, we can do that.
First, thank you so much. And with that, thank you to our presenters tonight with Amy, Mary Kate, Jamie Lynn, Bob, Lorinda. You were fantastic. It's a great evening. Appreciate all that you do for NAEA and teachers everywhere. With that, good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you. Thanks so much, everybody.